Welcome back to the deep dive. We are doing something today that I think is really long overdue. We're taking this huge stack of research. I mean, we've got history, theology, linguistics, and we're pointing it at a period of time that, frankly, most of us just get completely wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
We're going back to the Middle Ages.
The era everyone just loves to dismiss as the Dark Ages.
It's almost a reflex, isn't it? You say Middle Ages, and the brain just immediately defaults to, I don't know, Monty Python peasants covering themselves in mud.
Right, or just this general sense of intellectual static, nothing happening.
Exactly. We have this timeline in our heads. Rome falls, the lights go out, everybody sits around in the dark for 1,000 years, and then, poof, the Renaissance happens, and we invent science.
Which is, it's a very convenient narrative if you're living in the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, but it's just historically bankrupt.
Right.
When you actually comb through the reality of that period, between the fall of Rome in the 5th century and the Reformation in the 16th, the so-called Dark Ages were actually this incredibly dynamic, high-pressure transition period.
So not a void.
Not a void at all. It's a crucible.
Yeah.
You've got the rise of Islam completely redrawing the map. You have power centers shifting all over Europe, and you have the church desperately trying to consolidate its authority.
And that is the mission for this deep dive. We're not talking about knights and castles. We're talking about the medieval mind. Specifically, we want to get into how these people read their most important text, the Bible. And before you tune out thinking that sounds like some dry seminary class, just consider this.
Yeah, this is not that.
This is a story about how humanity balances tradition with new information. It's about how we decide what a text means when the world around us is, falling apart or changing completely.
And it is fundamentally the story of two diverging paths dealing with the exact same root material. That is the central tension we are going to explore.
The Jewish path and the Christian path.
Exactly. They are both staring at the same Hebrew scriptures, but they are building completely different intellectual and spiritual architectures on top of them.
Okay, so let's set the stage a little more. The Roman Empire collapses in the West. The political order is just gone. What's the actual state of the world for these scholars we're going to be talking about? It's not just darkness, as you said.
Far from it. It's chaotic, certainly, but the biggest game changer, and this is one that is so often overlooked in Western history classes, is the rise of Islam in the 7th century.
It's hard to overstate that, isn't it?
You really can't. This isn't just a political shift. It is a linguistic and intellectual earthquake. Suddenly, the dominant scholarly language in the entire Mediterranean isn't Latin or Greek anymore. It's Arabic.
Wow.
And the dominant religion is this new, powerful monotheism that is obsessed, absolutely obsessed with the grammar of its holy book, the Quran. That creates an immense pressure.
So you have this huge external pressure,
Yeah.
and inside that pressure cooker, you have the Jewish community. They're in exile.
Yeah.
The temple's been gone for centuries. They are scattered across Christian Europe and the Islamic world.
Right.
So what is their primary intellectual goal during this time? What are they trying to do?
Survive. But not just physical survival, intellectual and spiritual survival. The term we often use to describe the Jewish project in this era is actualization.
Actualization.
The question facing every Jewish scholar was, how do we keep the Torah alive and functional for a community that has no land, no temple, and is living as a minority under foreign rule?
So they're almost playing defense.
In a way, yes. They're building what the rabbis called a fence around the Torah. They need to preserve the traditions they have, the oral Torah, the midrash, and just make sure the community doesn't assimilate or forget who they are.
They're trying to make this ancient text actual for their present moment.
That's the perfect word for it.
And meanwhile, the Christians are doing something else entirely.
Oh, completely different. The Christian project wasn't preservation so much as it was reinterpretation.
Okay.
They aren't trying to preserve a national legal code in the same way. They are trying to justify a new faith using old texts. They are reading the Hebrew scriptures, which they now call the Old Testament, through a Christotelic lens.
Christotelic, that's a heavy term. Let's unpack that a little bit.
So telos in Greek means end or goal. Reading Christotelically means reading the text with the core assumption that the end goal of every single story, every law, and every prophecy is Jesus Christ.
So everything points in one direction.
Everything has to point to him. They had to, well, figuratively reshape the text. When Moses writes about a rock in the desert or a snake on a pole or the dimensions of the temple, the Christian scholar isn't primarily asking, what did this look like historically?
I'll ask you.
He's asking, how does this point to the New Testament reality? How is this rock a symbol of Christ?
So just to summarize, you have the Jewish scholars digging deep into the grammar and history to preserve the distinctiveness of their people. That's actualization. And you have Christian scholars building this massive, elaborate system of allegory to prove their theology. That's justification.
Exactly. And that friction, that tension between those two projects, it sparks some of the most brilliant literary analysis in human history. It's fascinating.
Let's start with the Jewish side of the equation then, because I think there's this misconception that Jewish interpretation was just one monolithic thing. You know, the rabbi said X.
Right, as if they all agreed.
But looking at the history, there was a massive internal civil war over how to read the Bible.
A fierce, fierce battle. And it really kicks off with a group called the Karaites. They emerge around the 8th century, mostly in the Islamic East, in Baghdad and places like that.
And the name? Karaites.
It comes from the Hebrew word kara, which means to read. They called themselves the men of Scripture.
That sounds like a good thing.
Yeah.
I mean, who wouldn't want to be a man of Scripture?
Well, the rabbis didn't, for one, because the Karaites were, in essence, Jewish Protestants 800 years before Martin Luther.
Wow.
Their entire platform was reject the oral Torah, reject the Talmud, reject the Midrash, reject the authority of the rabbi.
What was their main objection? What was their beef with the rabbis?
They felt the rabbis had buried the actual text of the Bible under just layers and layers of human tradition. You know, the Bible says don't work on the Sabbath, but then the rabbis write 50 pages defining precisely what work is. Is it carrying a key? Is it tying a knot?
Right, the details.
The Karaites just said, stop, let's just read what is written. They wanted peshat, the plain, simple, contextual sense of the text.
Sola scriptura, only the writing.
The exact same principle as the Reformation, yeah. And it sounds liberating. It sounds so simple. But here's the catch, and this is a really fascinating dialectical point.
Go on.
If you throw out all the tradition, you are now completely alone with the text. And if you encounter a word you don't understand, or a law that's vague, or a story that's confusing, you're stuck.
You don't have the cheat sheet of tradition anymore.
You have no cheat sheet. If the text in Deuteronomy says, bind these words as a sign in your hand, and you reject the rabbinic tradition that tells you how to make the little prayer boxes, the tefillin,
What do you do?
what do you actually do? You can't just say, well, the rabbi said. You have to figure it out from the grammar alone. You have to become a master linguist.
Which forces you to get scientific about the language. You have to understand the mechanics of Hebrew perfectly to derive the law.
Precisely. The Karaite rebellion, in a way, forced the entire Jewish world to get extremely rigorous and scientific about language. They couldn't just fall back on tradition says X. They had to prove it from the syntax, from the vocabulary, from the text itself.
And this leads to what scholars call the scientific turn.
The rise of philology, yeah.
Philology, the love of words.
The science of words. And this is where that Islamic influence we mentioned earlier is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
The Jewish scholars living in places like Spain and North Africa are watching their Arab neighbors develop this incredibly sophisticated system of grammar for the Quran. I mean, they're categorizing verbs, they're identifying roots, they're figuring out complex syntax rules.
And the Jewish scholars are taking notes.
They're looking over the fence and realizing we need to do this for Hebrew. We need to have that same level of rigor. It becomes an intellectual arms race.
So who are the key players in this?
Well, you have a giant like Jonah ibn Jonah in the 11th century. This guy he's a foundational figure. He's the one who really establishes the rule of the trilateral root.
I've read about this. This is the idea that almost every Hebrew word is built on a three-letter skeleton, right?
Yes. Before him, people thought maybe words were just random collections of sounds, or maybe they had two-letter roots or four. Ibn Jonah proved systematically that almost every verb and most nouns trace back to a core three-letter root.
That sounds really technical, but why is it so revolutionary?
Because it means the language has a DNA. It has rules. It's not arbitrary. You can't just make a word mean whatever you want it to mean because the root restricts you. It's like finding the periodic table for a language.
It puts guardrails on interpretation.
It constrains the interpreter. It forces you to be honest with the mechanics of the language. And that work sets the stage for the real heavyweights. I mean, you can't talk about the medieval Jewish mind without talking about Rashi.
Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki.
From France.
Rashi, the commentator par excellence. If you walk into a synagogue or a study hall today and pull a serious Bible off the shelf, a Mikrad Gedolot.
The great scriptures.
Rashi's commentary is printed right there on the page, literally wrapping around the biblical text. He is the gold standard. He's the first person you read.
So why? What made him so special compared to the pure grammarians?
Because pure grammar is dry. It's essential, it's necessary, but it doesn't feed the soul. It doesn't inspire you. Rashi was the absolute master of the middle way.
What do you mean by that? He fully accepted the new scientific grammar coming out of Spain. He knew his verb roots, he understood the syntax, but he also deeply knew and loved the old rabbinic legends, the midrash, the stories that flesh out the biblical narrative.
So he's mixing the science with the storytelling.
He's weaving them together seamlessly. He would look at a verse and first give you the peshat, the clear, literal meaning based on the grammar and the context. But if the grammar left a little gap, or if there was a strange word,
He'd fill it in.
he would fill it with a beautiful story from the tradition, an anecdote from the Talmud that illuminated the human drama of the text. He satisfied the head and the heart. He made the text sing in a way the dry grammarians simply couldn't.
But not everyone liked that mixing, did they? There was a sharper, some might say more cynical school of thought.
Oh, yes. Enter Abraham Ibn Ezra.
The rationalist.
Rationalist, the critic, the gadfly.
Ibn Ezra was this wandering scholar. He lived in Spain, Italy, France, England, and he had absolutely zero patience for fluff.
So no stories. No stories. If Rashi was the kindly grandfather telling you tales, Ibn Ezra was the strict, brilliant professor with a bright red pen. His view was simple and brutal. The text has one meaning.
Only one.
Only one, and that meaning is determined by grammar and context. Period. If your beloved tradition or your favorite story contradicts the clear grammar of the verse, then the tradition is wrong.
That is a very bold stance for a religious scholar in the 12th century.
It gets bolder. Ibn Ezra is famous now for what we call proto-biblical criticism.
Yeah.
He noticed things in the text, little details that just didn't make sense chronologically.
Such as?
Well, the classic example is in the book of Deuteronomy. The text describes Moses dying, being buried by God, and it says no one knows his burial place to this day.
And tradition holds that Moses wrote the entire Torah, all 5 books.
Right. But Ibn Ezra looks at that and basically says, wait a minute. How can Moses write an account of his own death and secret burial and then comment that the location is still secret to this day?
A dead man can't write about his own funeral.
A dead man can't write his own obituary. And Ibn Ezra writes this incredibly cryptic little note in his commentary, basically hinting, if you understand the mystery of the 12, you will know the truth.
The mystery of the 12. What's that?
He's almost certainly referring to the last 12 verses of Deuteronomy, the ones describing Moses' death. He's implying under his breath that someone else wrote them.
Maybe Joshua.
Probably Joshua or a later scribe, but he couldn't say it out loud because that would be heresy. It would get him excommunicated, or worse. So he encoded it. But he's planting this tiny seed of an idea that the Bible is a text with a history, not just a magical object dropped from the sky.
That's the scientific rationalist side.
Yeah.
But we have to balance this, because while Ibn Ezra is in his study dissecting verbs, there's another movement going in the complete opposite direction.
The mystics.
The Kabbalists.
The Kabbalists, this is the great counterweight to the rationalism.
Yeah.
They looked at the grammarians and basically said, you're doing excellent work dissecting the body of the Torah, but you're missing the soul.
And this is where we get the famous concept of pardes.
Yes. It's a Hebrew acronym, PRDS, which also spells the word for orchard or paradise. It represents 4 levels of interpretation.
Okay, let's walk through them.
So P is for peshat. That's the literal simple meaning, the stuff Ibn Ezra loved.
What happened, factually?
Exactly. R is for remez, which means hint. This is a more allegorical or philosophical layer. D is for darash, which is the homiletic, sermonic meaning, using the text to teach a moral lesson like Rashi would do.
And the last one?
S is for sod, the secret, the mystical meaning.
The secret.
For the Kabbalists, this was the entire point. They argued that the stories in the Bible, Abraham and Sarah, the wars, the Exodus, the donkeys, those are just outer garments.
Like clothes.
They're the clothes the text wears so that we mortals don't go blind looking at the raw spiritual light. But the real text, the sod, isn't about human history at all. It's about the internal life of God, the flow of divine energy in the cosmos.
So when the Bible talks about, say, Israel, the mystic might say,
The mystic might say, that's not really a nation in the Middle East. That's a code word for the aspect of the divine soul that yearns to reunite with the Creator.
okay, and you can immediately see the tension there.
A huge tension. If you go too far into the sod, into the secret, you risk evaporating history altogether. If Israel is just a metaphor for the soul, does the actual historical Jewish people matter anymore?
You completely dehistoricize the text.
And that is the perpetual danger of pure mysticism. It universalizes everything until the specific gritty historical reality just disappears in a puff of smoke.
Which is actually a perfect segue to the Christian world. Because if the Jewish tension was between grammar and mysticism, the Christian tension was between history and Christology. They had their own fourfold system.
They did. The Quadriga.
The Quadriga, it sounds like a piece of Roman machinery.
It was a chariot drawn by 4 horses, which is a great image for it. And this system drove the church's thinking on the Bible for 1,000 years. It's very similar on the surface to Part A, but the goal is completely different.
So what are the 4 senses?
You have the literal, then the allegorical, then the tropological, which is also called the moral sense, and finally, the anagogical.
Okay, let's break these down because this is really the operating system of the medieval Christian mind. Let's use the classic example from the research, the word Jerusalem.
Perfect. So you're a monk in a monastery, you're reading the Psalms, and you come across the word Jerusalem.
Okay.
First, you have the literal sense, the historical sense. Jerusalem is a city in Judea. It has walls. It had a king named David. It was conquered by the Babylonians. This is the foundation. What happened?
Straightforward enough.
Second, you have the allegorical sense. This is the faith layer. This is all about what to believe. Here, Jerusalem signifies the church, the body of Christ.
So history becomes theology.
Exactly. When the psalm says, peace be within your walls, the allegorical reading is, let there be peace and doctrinal unity within the church.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the third one?
Third is the tropological or moral sense. This is the action layer, what to do, how to live. Here, Jerusalem signifies the faithful human soul.
My own interior life.
Your own soul. So Jerusalem is built as a city, becomes a moral command. Build your character with virtues. Make your soul a well-ordered city.
And the fourth and final sense.
The anagogical sense. This is the hope layer. It's about eschatology, the end times. Here, Jerusalem is the heavenly city, the new Jerusalem waiting for us at the end of time.
So let me get this straight. A single word, Jerusalem, simultaneously means a dusty city in the Middle East, the Catholic Church, my own soul, and heaven.
All at the same time, yes.
Now, let me play the skeptic here. Because to a modern reader, or frankly to a rationalist like Ibn Ezra, this sounds like absolute chaos. If a word can mean 4 different things, does it actually mean anything? It feels like you can just make the text say whatever you want it to say.
And that was precisely the criticism. People worried it was a free-for-all, that it made interpretation totally subjective. But here is where we have to bring in Thomas Aquinas.
The heavyweight champion.
The heavyweight champion of medieval theology, absolutely. He steps into the ring to defend this system, and his argument is just so fascinatingly philosophical.
How does he possibly justify it?
He appeals to the nature of authorship. He says, look, when you or I write a book, we use words to signify things. If I write the word apple, those letters on the page point to the physical fruit. That is the limit of human authorial power.
Okay. Words point to things.
But God, Aquinas argues, is the author of reality itself. God doesn't just use words. God uses history. God has the power to arrange actual historical events so that the event itself signifies something else.
Wait, let me wrap my head around that. So you're saying Aquinas' argument is that a human author writes a metaphor, but God writes history as a metaphor.
That is a perfect way to put it. God orchestrated the entire history of Israel, the literal physical events, so that the thing itself, like the city of Jerusalem, would naturally and providentially point to these other realities, the church, the soul, and heaven.
So the multiple meanings aren't contradictory.
They're not contradictory, they're concentric circles of reality, all sustained by a single divine intent. The author is God, whose mind can hold all these meanings at once.
This implies that the world itself is a kind of text to be read.
It is the sacramental worldview. Everything you see, a tree, a river, a marriage, a city, is a physical reality, yes, but it is also a signpost pointing to a higher spiritual reality. Nothing is just itself.
That's a beautiful way of looking at the world, but I can also see how it could be dangerous. It seems to lead to huge conflicts when people disagree on what the signpost is pointing to.
Oh, absolutely.
And we have a specific case study from the research that I think illustrates this clash perfectly.
The famous boiling kid.
Exodus chapter 23, verse 19. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk.
This one little verse is one of the most debated verses in the entire history of biblical interpretation, and it just vividly shows the massive split between the Jewish and Christian mindsets.
So let's do it. Let's look at the Jewish reading first. Literal.
Right.
Contextual.
For the Jewish community, this is first and foremost a rule. It's a dietary law. It becomes the basis for kashrut, the laws of keeping kosher. You don't mix meat and dairy.
And the reason for the rule?
Well, that's debated. Maybe it's about having compassion, respecting the life-giving relationship between the mother and her offspring. Maybe, as some later scholars argued, it was a rejection of a specific pagan ritual. But whatever the reason, functionally, it is a boundary marker.
This is what we do. We are the people who don't boil kids in milk.
Exactly. It defines the community. It sets them apart. Now, contrast that with someone like Augustine, the great Christian father.
Okay.
He reads this verse and he's just baffled. He says, essentially, why would the God of the universe care about how you cook a goat? This is absurd. It's carnal. It's beneath the dignity of God. He found the literal meaning offensive.
So he just can't accept the literal sense. He has to find something else.
He completely rejects it. He assumes there must be a hidden spiritual meaning, so he fires up the allegory machine.
And what does he come up with?
He argues that the kid, the young goat, represents Christ. Why? Because a kid is innocent and a sacrificial animal.
Okay. A bit of a stretch, but let's go with it.
And the mother's milk, he argues, represents the milk phase of life, infancy, childhood.
Right.
So do not boil a kid in its mother's milk is actually a cryptic prophecy, which means Christ, the kid, will not be destroyed, boiled during the slaughter of the innocents, his infancy.
Wow. That's a stretch. I mean, come on. This sounds like he is completely hallucinating meaning that isn't there.
To our modern, historically minded ears, it sounds ridiculous. It sounds like he's forcing Jesus into a recipe, but you have to try to empathize with his goal.
Which is?
Augustine fundamentally believes the Old Testament is about Christ. That's his starting premise. So if the literal text seems boring or irrelevant or unworthy of God, he feels a moral and theological duty to dig until he finds the spiritual gold he knows must be there. He isn't trying to be deceptive. He's trying to be consistent with his worldview.
But this just highlights the fundamental rift so perfectly. The Jewish reader is looking for the rule. How should we live as a community?
Mm-hmm.
And the Christian reader, like Augustine, is looking for the person. How can I see Jesus in this text?
Finding the rule versus finding Christ. That is probably the best one-sentence summary of medieval hermeneutics you could have.
But it wasn't just Augustine's wild allegories forever. The Christians did eventually start listening to the Jewish rationalists, right?
Aye.
We see a shift in the 12th and 13th century.
They absolutely do. And we see the great rationalists, Maimonides on the Jewish side, Aquinas on the Christian side, trying to find a middle ground. They start asking the question, why?
The reason for the command.
Not just what it symbolizes, but what is the rationale behind it? Why did God give this command? Maimonides suggests it was to avoid pagan idolatry. Maybe the Canaanites boiled goats in milk as part of a fertility ritual, so Israel had to do the opposite.
Which is a historical argument.
A historical and cultural argument. A Christian scholar named Stephen Langton suggests it might be about hygiene. Maybe it's just bad for your digestion. And Aquinas suggests it's about preventing cruelty, that it hardens the human heart to cook a baby animal in the very fluid that was meant to sustain its life.
Which is much, much closer to how a modern person might read it. We look for the ethical or the cultural rationale.
Exactly. You see the shift from magic code to rational law.
And this intellectual shift coincides with a huge change in where theology is being done. This is the great move from the monastery to the university.
This is a huge cultural vibe shift. For centuries, theology happened in monasteries. These were quiet, contemplative, prayerful places. The goal was meditation, slow reading, what they called lectio divina.
Divine reading.
Right. But in the 12th century, you get the rise of the universitas. Paris, Oxford, Bologna. Suddenly, theology is happening in loud, crowded lecture halls. It's full of ambitious young men who want to debate. They are weaponizing Aristotelian logic. They're dissecting texts like surgeons.
This is scholasticism.
This is scholasticism, the schoolmen. And let me tell you, not everyone was happy about this new development.
Yep, there's a resistance.
A powerful resistance. And it was led by a man named Bernard of Clairvaux. He was really the last of the great monastic theologians. And he looked at these new universities, these young guys turning God into a logic puzzle, and he was absolutely horrified.
What was his critique?
He basically said, you are analyzing the text, but you aren't feeling it. You're not tasting it. You are turning the bread of life into a stone. He saw it as a spiritual crisis.
And his counterattack, his vision for what interpretation should be, was based on the Song of Songs.
The Song of Songs is the ultimate battleground for these two worldviews. On the surface, it's pretty explicit erotic poetry. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth.
It's seamy.
It is. And the rationalists, the scholastics, they didn't quite know what to do with it. It was a little embarrassing. But Bernard, he dove right in. He preached a series of 86 sermons just on the first couple of chapters.
86 sermons on a few verses.
He was obsessed. But for him, of course, it wasn't about human sex. He took that central image, the kiss of the mouth, and he just exploded it into this profound mystical theology.
What did the kiss represent for him?
He argued that the kiss is the incarnation of Christ. Think about the image. A kiss is the union of two breaths, two spirits. The spirit of the kisser and the spirit of the kissed become one,
Okay.
Bernard says. The kiss of the mouth is the perfect image for the union of the divine nature and the human nature in the person of Jesus Christ. It's the moment God and humanity touch.
That is incredibly intimate. It's poetic.
And deeply emotional. Bernard would stand in his cold monastery and weep over this. He'd say the Old Testament prophets were jealous of us. They longed for the kiss. They begged for it. They waited for God to come close. But we have the kiss. We have Christ. And yet, he says, we are bored. We are cold. We'd rather debate syllogisms.
Love is the measure of faith.
That was his motto. That was his critique of the university. You can be the smartest grammarian in the world. You can master the Quadriga. You can memorize all of Aristotle. But if you don't burn with love for God, you know nothing.
It's the difference between knowing the chemical definition of fire and actually getting burned.
That is a perfect analogy.
And this brings us full circle back to Aquinas, because Aquinas is the ultimate university man. They called him the dumb ox. He's the guy who wrote the Summa Theologica, literally millions of words, organizing every single aspect of reality into a perfect logical system.
The peak of scholasticism.
And yet the story of his life has this twist ending that I think is one of the most moving things in intellectual history.
The straw incident. It's December 6th, 1273. Aquinas is 49 years old. He's at the absolute height of his powers. He's nearly finished with the Summa. And one morning during Mass, he has an experience.
A vision, a mystical experience.
We don't know exactly what it was. It was a mystical encounter. Something happened to him that was so overwhelming, so direct, that afterwards he just stopped.
Stopped what?
Stopped everything. He went back to his cell and put his pen down. He refused to write or dictate another word. His secretary, a man named Reginald, is freaking out. He's begging him, Master, you have to write. You're almost done. The world is waiting for this masterpiece.
And what did Aquinas say?
He looked at him and said, I cannot. All that I have written appears to be as so much straw compared to what I have seen.
Straw. He calls his life's work the bedrock of Western theology for centuries straw.
It is the ultimate intellectual humility. He realized that the Quadriga, the logic, the scholastic arguments, they are just a ladder. They are useful tools to get you up there. But once you actually see the reality, once you see the moon, you don't need the finger pointing at the moon anymore.
You have to step off the ladder.
You step off the ladder and just be present to the reality itself.
That gives me chills every time I hear it. It suggests that the deep dive into the text, if it's successful, eventually has to end in silence.
It has to end in vision, in contact, not just analysis.
So we've got all these strands. We have the Jewish philologists in Spain sharpening the tools of grammar. We have the Christian scholastics in Paris building these cathedrals of logic. And we have the mystics on both sides demanding the soul of the text, the direct experience.
Mm-hmm.
How does all of this get us to the Reformation? Because the popular story is that Martin Luther just shows up one day and smashes the Middle Ages.
He does break with the structure, but he is absolutely standing on their shoulders. And the bridge The crucial missing link between the medieval world and the Reformation is philology.
The Jewish science of words.
The Jewish science of words. Remember Radak, David Kimchi, the Jewish grammarian who followed Rashi and Ibn Ezra?
The guy who synthesized it all.
Right. His books on Hebrew grammar and his commentaries didn't stay in the Jewish community. They migrated. A Christian scholar named Nicholas of Lyra, a Franciscan monk in the 14th century, got his hands on them. He learned Hebrew. And he wrote a massive commentary on the entire Bible that relied heavily on Rashi and Kimchi. He was obsessed with the literal sense.
So you have a Christian monk using Jewish grammar to critique centuries of Christian allegory.
That's exactly what happened. He was constantly saying, the Christians say this symbolizes X, but Rabbi Solomon says the Hebrew literally means Y. And guess who read Nicholas of Lyra's commentary?
It has to be Martin Luther.
Martin Luther had Lyra's commentary on his desk while he was translating the Bible into German. There is a famous Latin rhyme from the Reformation era.
Oh, what is it?
Si Lyra non lyrasit, Lutheris non saltessit.
Which means?
If Lyra had not played the lyre, Luther would not have danced.
That's incredible. That's the connection.
That's the direct connection. Luther's big idea, sola scriptura, the plain sense of the text. Let's go back to the original languages. That wasn't a spontaneous invention. It was the fruit of centuries of medieval Jewish and Christian scholarship. The Reformation owes a massive debt to Rashi, to Ibn Ezra, and to the philological revolution of the so-called Dark Ages.
That is a convergence that I think most people completely miss. We think of these religions as sealed boxes, but the ideas were leaking through the walls the entire time.
Absolutely. The conversation was always happening, even if it was quiet.
And then, of course, on top of all this intellectual ferment, you drop the atomic bomb of technology. The printing press.
1439, Gutenberg. This changes the exclusive clerical nature of interpretation forever. In the Middle Ages, the Bible was a rare, incredibly expensive manuscript. You needed a highly trained expert to read it to you and tell you what it meant.
Right.
Once you can print it, you put it in the hands of the butcher, the baker, the milkmaid. And that changes the hermeneutical game forever. Now, you don't need the Quadriga interpreted for you by a priest. You have the raw text in your own hands.
Which brings its own kind of chaos, as we've learned from the last 500 years of history.
Indeed. A whole new set of problems.
So what's the takeaway for us? I mean, we aren't medieval monks. We aren't Jewish exiles in Islamic Spain. We're modern people with iPhones. Why does any of this matter?
I think the biggest takeaway is a warning. A warning against what we could call academicism.
Explain that.
We live in the absolute golden age of information. You can go online right now and see the original Greek and Hebrew. You can read 20 different commentaries in an hour.
Yeah.
You can use AI to parse every verb. We are technologically superior to Aquinas and Rashi in every conceivable way.
Of course.
But the warning of Bernard of Clairvaux and the final silence of Aquinas is that mastering the mechanics of the text is utterly useless if it blinds us to the reality behind the text.
It's so easy to mistake knowing about something for actually knowing it.
Yes, we can dissect the text like a frog in biology class, and we can label all the parts, but a dissected frog is a dead frog. The goal of the medievals, at their very best, was to keep the frog alive, to encounter the living voice speaking through the words.
So the moral sense, the tropological sense, is still the point.
It has to be. If you can explain exactly what boiling a kid in its mother's milk means historically and culturally, but you're still cruel to your neighbor, you've failed the test. The literal and the spiritual must eventually meet in the transformed life of the reader.
That's a powerful place to land. It's not just about what we know. It's about who we become by knowing it.
Precisely.
Well, this has been quite a journey. From the crucible of the so-called Dark Ages, to the grammar wars of Spain, to the erotic mysticism of the French monks, and finally to the profound silence of Aquinas. It really changes how you look at that big leather-bound book on the shelf.
It's a book with a very deep and complicated history of people just trying to hear the voice of God.
And here's a final provocative thought for you listening. We talked about how the printing press changed everything by making the text accessible to everyone. Today, we're in the middle of another, maybe even bigger, revolution. We have artificial intelligence, we have instant translation, we have digital access to every manuscript ever found right at our fingertips. We are drowning in access.
We are.
Does that make us better readers? Or does the very ease of access, the lack of friction, actually make it harder for us to do the deep, slow, contemplative work of what Bernard called the kiss of the mouth, that deep, intimate, transformative connection with the text?
That is the question of our age, isn't it? Are we just skimming the surface of an infinite ocean of information? Or are we actually learning how to dive deep?
Something to mull over. Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time.
Goodbye.